Welcome to the tutorial video on purchasing according to ISO 13485. Unfortunately, you will notice that purchasing requirements in norm are still rather based off the old world of hardware medtech, where suppliers haul their products to the doors of your factory lines, but we'll anyways try to make the best of it for software use cases. As always, let's start by briefly looking at the ISO 13485 norm, and we will focus on section 7.4 in this case. There's a few things to point out here. First of all, you will need to document a procedure, an SOP, for purchasing in your QMS. Second, in this SOP, you should establish criteria for the evaluation and selection of the suppliers that you want to do business with. And once you've done that, you should set up a system of supplier surveillance that also includes a constant monitoring and re-evaluation of those suppliers. Moving on, you generally will need to maintain records of all the things that you purchased, and those should include specific information that is also mentioned by the norm. The norm gets even more specific. I want to point out one very specific thing, which is that the contracts with your suppliers should prohibit them to make any changes in the products and services unless they notify you prior to that implementation. And lastly, products and services you received must undergo an inspection to verify the conformity with your purchasing requirements. And ideally, the inspection's results should then be routed back to your supplier evaluation. Now let's look at our SOP template for purchasing next. As you might have noticed, this SOP contains quite a lot of general considerations up front, which we will first skip for now, and we will dive directly into the process steps. So step 1, suppliers must be approved before you can buy from them. And approved suppliers should be documented in a list, which in our templates we call a list of qualified suppliers, so that your employees can see which suppliers they can place an order with and with whom they can't. For the same reason, you should also document in your list if a supplier did not pass the approval process and is blocked. We will look at our template for a supplier list in the second video. If a supplier is not listed yet, employees need to turn to the QMO to carry out the approval process for the supplier. That means, in other words, the QMO first will check if the supplier's products and services are actually quality relevant for your organization. And here, let's quickly jump back up to the general considerations of this SOP. We define quality relevant as impact on product safety, product performance, regulatory compliance, or overall relevance for the manufacturing process in your QMS and company. And lastly, of course, the question if there's no alternative or equivalent supplier for these goods and services. That's how we define supplier criticality, or we propose to do that in our templates. Of course, there's a little bit of in-between things like indirect impact, which then can lead to case-by-case decisions by the QMO, but that's the general gist of it. Now going back to the process steps, there's one more thing to point out. Naturally, there's a lot of things in your company which are not relevant for quality purposes. So toilet paper, fruit baskets, or the classic coffee machine, let's say. That's why you should also give your QMO the superpower to sometimes make things easier in your company and decide if a supplier is obviously uncritical, and all the initial supplier criticality assessment does not need to be documented. Moving on, step 2. If the supplier is not listed yet, and if it's actually critical to your device safety, performance, and compliance, you now finally carry out the initial supplier evaluation for the new supplier. And we also have a template checklist for that, which we again will look at in our second video. For now, let's again jump back up to see the evaluation criteria we propose in our SOP. And remember first that the evaluation of a supplier according to certain criteria was one of the explicit ISO 13485 requirements that we looked at earlier. That means it's up to you to define criteria that you think make sense and that you would like to use. You just have to define some. And we suggest quality of the products and services, timeliness or punctuality, cooperation with you, and payment terms. You could then rate your suppliers on those criteria on a scale from 1 to 3, based on the information that is available to you, either publicly or in any other way. Now, going back to the process steps, most of the rest of the step was already mentioned. The results should then be added to the list of qualified suppliers. And I should also mention that if a supplier setup changes, let's say it initially was blocked in your list, but then if the circumstances change for that supplier, you can then reapprove a blocked supplier by carrying out a new supplier evaluation and repeating this process step and creating a new supplier checklist record. Next step is budget approval. This is obviously not quality relevant and also not required by the norm. We just thought that most companies would like to control their budget at this point. So if you have unlimited capital and you don't care, you can also remove this step. Step 4, verification, is quite important though. Remember, this was also one of the things explicitly required by the norm. Once you've received your goods or services that you've ordered, you need to check if those actually meet your expectations. And rating every product delivery or service provision is part of your ongoing supplier evaluation. That's another 13485 requirement. It's also important here to keep records of the invoices and receipts of purchases, not just for taxes and accounting, obviously, but also for quality assurance purposes and traceability too. Step 5 here becomes a little bit more complex. Now, we already know that we update the evaluation based on the verification of every product and service purchased. That is here paragraph 2.5.1. Any new information can lead to a new evaluation status. It could happen, though, that you don't purchase anything from an approved supplier throughout an entire year. And keep in mind that you should carry out at least an annual reevaluation of every supplier, and that is section 2.5.2, what's described here. One last thing to point out in our process before we dive into examples. I've just skipped this part here, supplier surveillance measures, and that is actually quite relevant still. Supplier evaluation is obviously very much a case-by-case decision at the discretion of the QMO. So some suppliers may be more or less critical. The 13485 norm then explicitly emphasizes that supplier management should be handled proportionate to the risk associated with the purchased product or service. And following that thought, your QMO can decide to impose various supplier surveillance measures. That's the background for this section here. For example, for more critical suppliers, you might require them to have a quality management system, either according to 13485 or more easily according to ISO 9001. That's this part here. If you outsource an entire process, like software development or clinical evaluation, to a third party, you should also make sure to sign a quality assurance agreement with that supplier. 13485 explicitly requires you to sign such agreements in its section 4.1.5 if you want to look that up. So that's the second measure a QMO could take when approving a supplier. Last one, supplier audits, are rather uncommon for software device manufacturers, in my opinion. If you look at cloud providers like AWS, Google, or Telecom, those might be suppliers, for example, then they just have too much market power to seriously care about the implications of smaller companies auditing them. However, you should nevertheless take this aspect seriously, because in my experience, notified bodies explicitly check the contracts with critical suppliers to look for clauses that allow you to conduct supplier audits. Also, do consider that such audits don't necessarily need to mean that you send your QMO out to inspect their premises. They could also take the form of document-based audits, where they simply make certain documentation available to you. And I think that's actually the most common provision in such contracts. So that was a lot of information on supplier surveillance, supplier evaluation, and purchasing in general. Sorry for that. As you can see, supplier management can become quite a tricky topic, depending on your company and supplier setup. But let's dive into some examples and our templates next.